The next day both men were up at their usual 5 o'clock. Zino made oatmeal and coffee, and they ate in silence. Nothing of the night before was discussed. Joe had slept on the floor, wrapped up in one of old Zino's rough wool blankets. It was a gray morning, with unusually heavy cloud cover. Joe was reminded of many dark mornings on board the ship he had lived on for 3.5 years. World War II had ended 4 years before, but not for Joe. He'd had another nightmare that troubled his sleep. The war still raged on within him. He flashed back at times. One time his horse ran under a low-hanging branch and knocked him out of the saddle, flat on the ground. He'd panicked, jumped up and ran around in circles, searching in vain for the radio room, for his post on the frigate. He had been a Navy seaman, manning the dit-dit-da-das of the frigate's powerful radio. He came back to reality after a few minutes, sweat-drenched and teeth clenched. At other times, like this morning, Joe would sit staring 1,000 yards into the distance. In his mind, he relived the life with the other young men in those long years of fighting a war on the Pacific Ocean together. Zino glanced over his coffee cup and saw the glazed stare on Joe's face. "Back on the agua again, eh, amigo?" After a few seconds, Joe's focus came back to the little table in old Zino's lean-to. He smiled slightly. "I ever tell you about the kamikazes?" "No, you never did, I think." "Como? What that mean? Kamikaze." Zino pronounced the word awkwardly and grinned. "They were young Japanese boys they strapped into tiny little rocket planes, packed with TNT explosives. They would dive right down on the ship. We never got hit by one because our gunners were real good. They always shot one down when it dived on the ship." "Did any of those boys live? Did they land again? Did they have parachutes?" Zino inquired. "No, a kamikaze mission was a one-way trip. There was no landing gear on those planes. There were no parachutes. They had to pilot those flying bombs right into the ships. It was always a suicide mission, even when they didn't hit the target." Zino's mouth dropped open and he glared into space. "Muy loco! That is great evil, I think." "You're damned right it was evil. One time I was out on the deck when one attacked. The gunners were pounding away with the 50 calibers, but they were having a hard time hitting him. This kamikaze was whipping that little flying bomb around like crazy. As he came closer, I looked over at the old man." "There was an old man on that ship?" "Well, we called him the old man. See, most of us were still in our teens or young 20s. The captain was one of the oldest officers. I guess he was about 45. That was old to us, so we just called him the old man. Not to his face, of course. Anyway, the old man was just standing there with his hands on his hips, staring up at the diving kamikaze so serene, like he was watching a kite at a picnic or something. I thought, he's not a bit afraid. I'm glad I'm not scared either. Then I looked down at my legs. My knees were knocking together so bad I could barely stand. Then I knew I was really scared shitless." Zino considered this for a moment, then said, "I am no surprise. You not always know what your body tell you. I see this, my friend. Must touch with your body. Better for you. Could save your life some mañana." "You could be right, my friend. Well, I've got to get back to the ranch. I promised the boss's wife I'd let her learn me something new every Sunday. She acts like there's something wrong with me just 'cause I didn't finish high school. So I've got to get back and clean up so I don't stink up her fancy library. I'm not happy about it. But I promised her I would do it, so I've got to do it." He said this as he strapped on his belt and holster with his long-barreled pistol. "You talk of Senora Helena, eh? With all those books in her casa?" "Yes, that's her. And I'll say she has a lot of books. Hundreds." Joe spread his arms wide in the air. Helena walked up to the back door of her house with a basket of hen eggs dangling from her elbow. Joe stood there waiting. She looked him up and down and grimaced. "You were drinking again last night, weren't you, young man?" "Just a little tequila with old Zino is all." I can smell it on you. You look ragged out. You need to eat better and drink less, she said with concern. Don't you worry, Mrs. Groden. I can handle my liquor just fine, Joe frowned. But maybe we can take a rain check today, if that's okay by you? Oh, no, you don't. You're not going to use your hangover as an excuse to stop learning, Joe. Please stop being so formal. Just call me Helena, she scolded him as she waved him into her house. Joe stayed silent as he walked ahead of her into the house. He trudged down the hallway to the room she called her library and sat down heavily in one of her high-backed, overstuffed reading chairs. I don't know why you want me coming here anyway. You know I never finished ninth grade. What's the point? Joe growled with a surly look at the walls of books. Helena rolled her eyes and planted both hands on her hips. That is exactly the point. You are much smarter than you know. I've tried to explain this to you before a few times. You don't know yourself at all, Joe. Your talents are completely wasted out here with these cowpokes. You could be so much more if you would just try, even a little bit, to educate yourself. She spat this last part out as if it was a frustrated refrain that she repeated regularly, which she had. Helena was an odd duck in her family. She was the wife of a cattle rancher living in the canyon lands of the High Plains in southeastern Colorado. She served as the business manager of the ranch. Her husband left that all to her, as he had little proclivity for it. She cooked meals for her family and the ranch hands too. She did all the mending, most of the gardening and mothering for everyone on the ranch. She could have had a very different life, perhaps. When she was young, she had traveled, seen most of the world. She could speak 3 languages. She had a teaching degree from Texas State University. She was an accomplished artist in oils and watercolors. She was well read and had written 2 books, many short stories, and some poetry. Her cooking was on the gourmet level. Few others in her family had achieved the level of intelligentsia and culture that she had. She was, however, a very private person, so many local people were unaware of her attainments. Helena was an independent person of many interests and talents. Yet she loved her husband and could never quite get him to overcome his dedication to an isolated, hard-scrabble life on his father's Sandrock homestead in the middle of nowhere, 60 miles from the nearest town of 2,000 people, La Junta, Colorado. A few months after her husband had hired Joe, Helena had come to understand that, in her estimation, Joe was a true diamond in the rough. He showed an interest in her fine library and reading room. So one Sunday she had invited him into her library and explained to him that she could help him finish his education on Sundays and evenings if he would commit to following her instructions. It took some convincing, but she had finally achieved his compliance. Joe stared at Helena with quizzical interest. Helena slowly took a deep breath and let it out. Joe, I know you are not going to remember this, but someday I hope you will be able somehow to remember. You have a rare form of autism. I have tried to get this through to you many times, Helena slowly explained. Joe's eyes widened and anger flashed as he replied, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not a retard, and as far as I know, this is the first time you've ever said such a crazy thing. Helena closed her eyes and sighed. Then she spoke in a soothing, calm voice. Yes, yes. So you always say. You look like a frightened animal backed into a corner, not sure whether you should fight or flee. That is how you are feeling right now, isn't it? Why are you so afraid? As I've explained many times, autism is not retardation. Quite the opposite, actually. Please calm down. I am only trying to help you, not hurt you in any way. Can you see that? Joe stared at the floor and took a few quick breaths. He looked as though he was about to faint or possibly go to sleep. Through clenched teeth, he replied sleepily, I know you mean well, but you are crazy if you think anything you're talking about applies to me. I'm just a regular guy. I'm just like everybody else, and that's obvious. You're the one that can't see straight. Then he actually did fall asleep for several seconds, his head flopping down onto his chest. He awoke quickly and looked around. He seemed puzzled and asked Helena, "What were we just talking about?" Helena shook her head slightly and remained silent for a long time. After a full minute, Joe shifted in his seat and began speaking, clearly not remembering anything that had just transpired. Real and effective selective memory did its usual number. He started speaking as though he had just arrived. "Well, I finished that book you loaned me. Sorry I forgot to bring it back. But I'll get it back to you soon," Joe said. "Which book was that?" "It's called For Whom the Bell Tolls, by something to do with a Henway," Joe replied with a sly grin. "What Henway?" "Oh, they weigh about 3 pounds," Joe guffawed as Helena glared. She shot back at him. "His name is Ernest Hemingway. It is important to remember author names correctly." "I was just funning you." "Ain't you got no sense of humor at all?" Joe asked. Ignoring him, Helena sat in one of the comfortable reading chairs and looked at him directly. "What did you think of the story?" Joe stared into her face for a few moments and then quietly reported, "War is brutal, all right. Hemingway got that part all the way. I liked that he didn't pull any punches. It was real. It was real and sad. I'll never read it again, but I'm glad you got me to read it." Then he pulled back, crossed his arms, and looked far off into nothing without saying another word. Gobbledygook. "Oh, Joe, just give it a try. I think you'll find, once you overcome the challenges of his vocabulary, he paints a lively tale, quite long ago, of an adventure on the high seas that also conveys a great deal of his philosophy." Ugh! Why would I want to read anything to do with high seas? I've told you before, I got my fill of living on the ocean in the war. I never want to see any large body of water again. Why do you think I'd want to read about it?" He extended his arm to hand the book back to her. Helena crossed her arms and said, "It's not so much about living on the high seas as other things. I think it's important for you to learn. Please read it, and then we'll talk about it afterwards." He tried to read it a few times, but something about the story haunted him so that he always put it down. Then Helena asked Joe if he'd be willing to stop talking about books and maritime philosophy and go on a little magical journey with her. He complied with a grin. "You gonna smoke the peyote? Old Zino told me about that particular mushroom. He does it sometimes. Damn strange when he's on it. Always pukes his guts out. I guess it's poisoned somewhat. I have to admit I've collected a few of those puffball mushrooms. Just never got up the nerve to try it. Zino says he sees his spirit animal on journeys far away, even though he's strutting around right in front of me," Joe explained. Helena looked at him, quite concerned, and with a hawk-like focus as if he might actually be high on the mysterious hallucinogenic mushroom peyote, which grew everywhere on the high plains. She looked him up and down and said, "Well, you haven't tried that peyote, have you?" Joe threw her a lopsided grin and said, "Nah, I thought about it. I've got whiskey, that's enough for me." Helena rolled her eyes, sighed, and then rolled her head around to loosen up her neck and shoulders. She slid back a little and got a little bit more comfortable in her easy chair. She pointed over to the easy chair Joe was sitting in and said, "Now, you slide back and get real comfortable, and try to play along with me as I do this meditation thing. It's a new thing for me, which I just learned about in my Oriental studies. I think this will really help you, Joe. If you will just let me lead you through it, will you do that for me?" Joe slouched down and got more comfortable and grinned. And then he grimly replied, "All right, show me what to do. I don't learn things from books that well, but I can do anything once someone shows me how to do it. First time." That's exactly the attitude we need right now. Okay, now just close your eyes and match your breathing to my breathing. Slowly inhale through your nose and then slowly exhale through your mouth, like this. Helena led Joe into the beginnings of a healing meditation, or at least what would become known as a healing meditation. In the USA, in only a couple more decades, what she was doing would not be considered unusual. Helena had actually mastered this particular practice in her own life. She hoped it would add enough to Joe's life to help him avoid becoming just another promising cowboy alky. She herself had been such an isolated prodigy, a type of person that is sometimes labeled nowadays as an indigo child, and she was certainly on the spectrum of autism herself. Autism is a term often applied to people who are so diagnosed, based upon the definition of the autism spectrum disorder, ASD, as it was defined many years later, but without as much of the debilitating side effects of the seeming affliction. Today, she would be labeled a high-functioning autistic person. She was unaware that on her own, she had perfected her own type of instant regression therapy through organic use of her deep hypnosis ability. To her, it just seemed like she could really connect with people. To them, she was able to unlock hidden and important memories. So many considered her to be very special. She applied this special hypnosis ability now to Joe while she led him through a directed meditation to connect him with some important memories.